Greetings, this is Greg. During World War II in the Southwest Pacific, especially during 1943 and well into 1944, U.S. Fifth Air Force Republic P-47 Thunderbolts were utilizing an Australian-built drop tank, often called the Brisbane tank. These tanks extended the combat and escorting radius of the big fighter from about 230 miles without a drop tank to an easy 450 miles farther in some cases. A lot of the missions involving Fifth Air Force Thunderbolts were over New Guinea. Many of these missions required the Thunderbolts to fly 300 to 350 miles. But there are some where they went quite a bit farther. Thus, the Brisbane tank was critical, especially so because in the United States, no adequate drop tanks had been put into production for the Thunderbolt, let alone delivered into the theater. Adequate for the Thunderbolt, in this case, means capable of holding at least 200 gallons, usable up to the altitudes needed for the plane, and, of course, with fittings to attach to the belly of the earlier D-model Thunderbolts, which were in use by the Fifth Air Force at the time. That generally means P-47 D2s and D4s. This lack of a suitable 200-gallon drop tank was ironic, as Republic aircraft had designed a pair of 200-gallon tanks in 1942, and in July of that year, told the U.S. Army Air Force that they could have 1,200 of them within 60 days of receiving the order. Well, the order for that metal drop tank never came, although it was built. So in 1943, the Fifth Air Force had to solve this problem on their own. Thankfully they did, and that, in a nutshell, is how we got the Brisbane tank. I have an entire video on that saga, so let's move on. This is a modern-day map of New Guinea. During 1943, this is where the vast majority of Thunderbolt operations in the Pacific took place. Initially in August of 1943, Thunderbolts were based in various airports, all right around Port Moresby. The Japanese air power was primarily based at Wewak, although their regional government supply depots and additional air power was a little farther away at Hollandia. From Port Moresby, P-47 Thunderbolts flew to attack the Japanese in the Markham Valley, just west of Finschhafen. That's about 230 miles from Port Moresby. By October, the U.S. and Australians had taken the Markham Valley, soon after had airfields operational there and a bit beyond. Finschhafen was one, Silly was another. I'll be using this document quite a bit for pictures and information. Of course, it's in my Patreon section if you want to read through it entirely. This page shows where various fighter groups were based in December of 1943. The 348th Fighter Group was based at Finschhafen. It's the only one here that has P-47s. Note that the group is made up of 3 squadrons. Each squadron was normally 12 to 16 airplanes. From these new bases, they started to fly sorties against the Japanese at Wewak. Before we go farther, I think we really need to get a sense of scale here. People underestimate the size of New Guinea. It's a big island, the second largest in the world. I'm going to put New Guinea side by side with the area in which the 8th Air Force was primarily operating in over Europe in 1943. These maps are to the same scale for an easy visual comparison. U.S. bases are marked with blue, German locations with a black dot, Japanese bases with a red dot. On the map of Europe, I marked the 56 Fighter Group's base at Halesworth, where they had P-47s, and in Germany I put various targets that were hit by the 8th's bombers. As you can see, the distances are extremely comparable, which brings up what should be a very obvious question about U.S. bombing raids in 1943. How is it that the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific Theater was able to escort B-24s at high altitudes all the way to the targets when the 8th Air Force, with the same airplanes and targets at similar distances, could not? This is a very important question because the U.S. Army Air Force lost a lot of unescorted bombers and men over Europe in 1943. The answer is in the fact that the 5th had a 200-gallon drop tank, a good fuel pump setup, and leadership that wasn't drinking the bomber mafia Kool-Aid. In short, General Kenny of the 5th Air Force wanted his fighters to escort the bombers all the way to the target, and he made this a top priority. In a recent live debate here on this channel, when I asked Mr. Marshall why the 8th Air Force couldn't just do the same thing, his answer was one word: altitude. Clearly, that's not correct, as the Brisbane drop tank was good to 35,000 feet, more than enough altitude. As this drop tank was designed and built locally with limited resources, there is absolutely no reason that the might of U.S. industry could not have done the same thing. There seems to be a secondary argument about dates, times and dates. That doesn't hold any water either, as General Kenny had suitable drop tanks within about 6 weeks of figuring out he had to do this without getting help through official channels. Thus, there is no reason the U.S. Army Air Force in the United States could not have done the same thing much earlier and got them over to England even more quickly. They had far superior production capacity on hand and a very strong supply chain to Europe. It appeared to me during the debate that Mr. Marshall was under the impression that P-47s in the Pacific Theater were mostly engaged in low-altitude work. I may have misunderstood him. There were some technical difficulties with the audio during the discussion. However, many authors and historians have that very misconception. I've read this many times, so I want to dispel this idea. Due to the mountains, the size of New Guinea, the good performance of Japanese fighters at low altitudes, Japanese anti-aircraft fire, and mostly the need to escort high-altitude bombers, much if not most of the P-47's work was at altitudes comparable to those flown in the 8th Air Force missions over Europe. Going through this book, there are numerous mentions of missions being flown at 28,000 feet, sometimes higher. The truth is that 24,000 to 28,000 feet was the norm for Thunderbolts over New Guinea. Let's talk about some of these missions, starting with Neil Kirby's Medal of Honor mission. Neil Kirby was the commander of the 348th Fighter Group, a group flying Thunderbolts at the time. On October 11, 1943, Kirby and 3 other pilots were flying their Thunderbolts on patrol up at 28,000 feet. That was the normal tactic for Thunderbolts, stay high and pounce on a hopefully unsuspecting enemy. They encountered a group of 40 Japanese fighters below them. These were made up of Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys. Some sources say there were actually 36 fighters and 12 bombers. As with most Pacific Theater stuff, details are sometimes hard to verify. In any case, the 4 Thunderbolts were outnumbered at least 10 to 1. Yet Kirby's Thunderbolts pressed the attack, and by using boom and zoom tactics, taking advantage of cloud cover, and by staying up high as much as possible, they shot down a number of Japanese aircraft without so much as a scratch on any of the Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt pilots claimed 9 kills, 6 of them Kirby's. When low on fuel, they turned for home. As they did so, the pilots looked back and saw 7 fires burning, presumably from crashed Japanese airplanes. Of course, aircraft kill claims were always higher than reality. This wasn't because people were lying, although sometimes that certainly was the case. More often, it was confusion during the chaos of combat. For example, 2 pilots might both shoot at the same airplane and both claim it. Sometimes the first would think it's shot down, then turn his attention elsewhere. Then a second plane would put rounds into the same target, sending it down for sure. Both pilots would be unaware that the other was claiming the same airplane. Other times, a plane looks like it's going down, and the pilot claims it, but in fact the plane was only damaged and limped back to base. After the war, Japanese records showed that only 2 fighters were lost in this engagement. However, both of the pilots lost were killed, and they were a squadron leader and a wing commander. That creates a bit of a kill confirmation quandary for me. Japanese records were not always great, and I think the records are only showing the high-ranking officers who were killed in this particular engagement. I'm basing that on a few things. First, as with the Germans, the Japanese were running out of pilots faster than airplanes. If a pilot bailed out or crashed but had been recovered and returned to duty, that may not have been worthy of mention because they still had more planes than pilots, thus it wouldn't degrade their operations much. Of those pilots, the Japanese Army placed very little to no value on the lower-ranking men. Omitting those losses from a report doesn't seem out of character to me. Furthermore, the odds that after a 1-hour-long battle, the only 2 losses, being a squadron commander and a wing commander, just seem unlikely to me. Typically, those would be the 2 guys that survived the battle, and it's normally the less experienced pilots who are lost. So I simply don't believe that it was only 2 planes. I'm not saying it was 9. I just don't know, and I don't think anyone alive today does. It's worth pointing out that on this mission, these 4 Thunderbolts fought for 1 hour and then traveled back to base, a distance around 300 miles. That's at the limit of what the plane can do, but it's not impossible, as has been claimed. As this was a Medal of Honor flight, I feel the need to address the claim that the distance involved was impossible. We do know that this was a 1 hour long fight, but we don't know what power settings were used, and that's a huge variable here. At the absolute most, meaning the most fuel the Thunderbolts could have consumed, would have been had they run at war emergency power for 5 minutes, that would use 23 gallons of fuel, and then at maximum continuous power for the remaining 55 minutes, and that would use another 193 gallons. Thus, the most fuel they could have realistically used in a 1 hour long fight was 216 gallons. It's a certainty that they used less than that with their boom and zoom tactics. They would not have been running at max continuous power during each diving attack. Still, let's say they did use the maximum possible amount of 216 gallons. I don't see any way that they did, but let's say that's what happened. Then, if the pilots managed their fuel system correctly and had 305 gallons of internal fuel at the time they dropped their tanks, that would leave them with 89 gallons on board. Not much. These were Thunderbolt D4s, which, if using maximum fuel economy power settings, will go about 3.3 miles per gallon when flying without a drop tank. Considering the fuel saved in the descent, that 89 gallons is just barely enough to go 300 miles in near perfect conditions, but it can do it. The numbers do work out. So I don't see the need to question 4 pilots from a well-documented mission, especially as the distance on the return leg has no bearing on the specifics of the mission that led to the various commendations. Of course, the reality is that they probably used a lot less than 216 gallons of fuel. They probably spent some time up on their perch, throttled back a bit, waiting for just the right moment to dive, and may have even had their engine near idle during those dives. Plus, it's quite possible that they had a tailwind on the return leg. Neil Kirby's Medal of Honor mission is of historical significance for a number of reasons, and among those is the fact that these Thunderbolt D4s, with the Brisbane fuel tank starting out from 28,000 feet, fought for 1 hour while greatly outnumbered, and then flew 300 miles back to base. Other than the P-38 Lightning, no other fighter in combat at that time could have done that. Of course, normally, a P-47 would not stay in combat for an hour. 20 minutes was normally used for planning, and that was on the high side of what was needed. Thus, the P-47 with the Brisbane tank could range well beyond the 300 miles we saw from Kirby's Medal of Honor mission. To get a more solid idea of the distances involved in the U.S. attacks on the Japanese, let's pull up a map from that 1944 document. The distances shown here are Finschhafen to Wewak, 365 miles, and Nasdab, a base very frequently used by Thunderbolts, was 328 miles from Wewak. Keep in mind, there were actually 4 Japanese airfields in the Wewak area that the U.S. was attacking: Dagwa, Butt, Wewak, and Borum. Here's a close-up map, and as you can see, the farthest airfield is about 25 or 30 miles from Wewak, so that has to be factored in some cases. Also, some reports put P-47s over Kairuru Island during this time period. The point being that bomber escort missions to Wewak required a 350-mile combat radius, and they were somewhat common for Razorback Thunderbolts of the Fifth Air Force using the Brisbane tank. Now I'll add in those 8th Air Force targets we talked about earlier, so you can compare directly the Pacific and European theaters. The maps don't lie. Escorting to targets in Germany with P-47 Razorbacks was absolutely possible in 1943 with the right drop tank. It didn't happen due to poor decision-making, nothing else. Now, there was at least one case in which the P-47s provided bomber escort to Wewak from Port Moresby, about 470 miles away. This is at the very edge of the range for a Razorback Thunderbolt. This came up in the debate. Mr. Marshall seemed to think that the mission I was talking about took off from Port Moresby and landed to refuel at Silly Silly before flying to Wewak. That's incorrect. It's not that they didn't ever do that. It's not that they didn't do that on other missions. It certainly happened, but not in the specific case I was talking about. I want to cover this in detail, not only because it came up in the debate and I didn't have time to fully cover it then, but because this mission really demonstrates what the Fifth Air Force guys were dealing with. It's not just about range, and it's not just about combat. Flying a fighter in World War II presented all sorts of challenges and dangers. On October 22nd of 1943, Thunderbolts of the 341st Squadron flew from 7 Mile Drome, which is an airfield at Port Moresby, to Wewak, a Japanese stronghold, to escort B-25s. The Thunderbolts took off at 8:40 a.m. and arrived over Wewak at 10:15 a.m. That's 1 hour and 35 minutes later. Clearly, they did not land and refuel anywhere. What's not known, at least I can't find it, is what the 341st did or was supposed to do after they fought over Wewak. Did they return directly to Port Moresby? Did they land somewhere else and refuel on the way back? The 341st didn't score any air-to-air kills that day, and none of them were shot down, so not a lot is written about this mission. However, one plane failed to return, and when a plane is lost, there tend to be records of that. The website Pacific Rex is doing a great job of organizing this information, and it's where I got some of this mission data. The people that run the site are doing some serious work over there, which includes literally trudging through jungles and marshes to find wreckages of World War II airplanes. Their work is very impressive. Now, the plane lost was flown by a Lieutenant Harold Jacoby. Over Wewak, he was somehow separated from the rest of his squadron, the 341st, and then joined up with a pair of Thunderbolts from the 342nd. Both of those Thunderbolts had been separated from their squadron. The 342nd flew this mission to Wewak from Silly Silly, which I'll add to our map. Keep in mind, it's the 342nd that took off from Silly Silly on this date, not the 341st. Silly Silly was a base created by the U.S. Army in June of 1943. The fact that it did not previously exist meant that for a short time the Japanese didn't know about it. However, in August they found it, and it was attacked by the Japanese during August and September of 43. General Kenny disliked the name Silly Silly. He wanted to change it, but for some reason it didn't get done. I think he was right. It's a stupid name, and there isn't even agreement on how to spell it. Anyway, our 3 pilots at this point decide to head towards Bena Bena, which wasn't a place Thunderbolts would normally go. It wasn't really a base. No airplanes were ever based there. It was just a dirt runway where C-47s would drop off supplies and then leave. It was also the focus of Japanese attacks for a while. It seems the Japanese overestimated the importance of Bena Bena as compared with other Allied airstrips. I've never read any explanation for why that was. Back to our trio. Going towards Bena Bena was a decent plan. Once overhead, they could then navigate to Silly Silly, Bulldog, or Port Moresby. However, they got hopelessly screwed up and ended up over the Fly River, which is here. This was a big screw-up. I'm not knocking them. Instrument flying and navigation in a fighter over New Guinea was very difficult, much more so than over Europe. And on this day, the weather wasn't cooperating with them either. They were down at 1,500 feet, probably to stay below the clouds and probably following the river for navigation. Thus, the Thunderbolts were drinking a lot of fuel and not heading in the right direction. It was over the Fly River that our trio of First Lieutenant Thunderbolt pilots decided to split up. Jacoby from the 341st, along with Lieutenant Frankfurt from the 342nd, decided to try and reach Bulldog Airfield. I'm assuming that's because they wanted to stay under the clouds, and Bulldog was on their side of the mountains. Bulldog was another airfield that wasn't much of a base, but it could be used, especially when the chips were down. Jacoby was the first to run out of fuel. You would expect that. He had been in the air the longest. I guess it's not a certainty that he literally ran the tanks dry, but in any case, he was so low on fuel, he knew he would have to bail out, and he did. That was about here. We don't know exactly where, because neither Jacoby nor his plane were ever found. Going down in New Guinea was really bad. A lot of pilots who did so were never seen again. Lieutenant Frankfurt bailed out shortly after. He was helped by natives, walked to a rubber plantation, and was eventually able to contact the U.S. Army. After about a 10-day ordeal, he was picked up by a PBY that landed on the Fly River. The third pilot, Lieutenant Burgess of the 342nd, the one who struck off on his own, he did the best of the 3. He also bailed out but was helped by natives and walked out of the jungle to an Australian spotting station at Kikori. From there, it was just a question of waiting for that PBY. Frankfurt and Burgess continued to fly together in Thunderbolts. On one such mission, Frankfurt went down, and this time, sadly, he didn't make it. His aircraft and remains were not found until 1991 and not recovered until 1995. However, this isn't the last we will hear of Lieutenant Frankfurt in this video. I'll come back to him in just a moment. Burgess was the only one of the trio who survived the war. Not all of the 348th Fighter Group action was over New Guinea. A lot of it was over New Britain and New Ireland, just to the north. And these missions were to a large extent flown from Finschhafen. One particularly famous mission was on February 15th of 1944. That's the day that Nathan Gordon, flying a PBY Catalina named Arkansas Traveler, rescued 15 downed airmen near Kavieng Harbor. This was a very dangerous and daring mission involving multiple overweight takeoff and water landings while under enemy fire and during heavy swells. This required tremendous bravery and airmanship, for which the pilot was awarded the Medal of Honor and every member of the PBY crew was awarded the Silver Star. A lot has been written about this mission, but what often gets left out is the involvement of the P-47 Thunderbolts. They were providing covering fire for the PBY. One of those Thunderbolts was piloted by Lieutenant Frankfurt from our earlier story. His plane took damage from ground fire, but he made it back to base and was awarded the Silver Star for his participation in this mission. I like to think that one of the Thunderbolts in this artwork from Ace's High Gallery is his plane. Now, this mission was flown from Finschhafen, 340 miles from Kavieng Harbor. That's also where the PBY went after this mission, which is interesting. So those are two Pacific Theater Thunderbolt missions with Razorback planes in the 300 to 350 mile range. Both are missions in which pilots were awarded the Medal of Honor. Neil Kirby in the P-47 and Nathan Gordon in his PBY. That makes these missions very easy to look up and verify. Both of these missions give good examples of Thunderbolt range, as one had fighting at high altitude and the other, the fighting was down on the deck. Now, I know someone is going to say, but this latest mission was from 1944, thus the plane could have had dual wing tanks, not the Brisbane tank. Well, I'm pretty sure it used the Brisbane tank because this mission was from February of 1944, and I don't think the 348th had newer Thunderbolts with wing pylons at that point. If anyone has evidence to the contrary, I would love to see it. The bottom line, I suppose, is I don't know for sure what drop tanks were used on this mission. Sadly, the type of drop tanks used on the mission is a detail that's often left out of the records, but I submit to you that it doesn't really matter. We established in the previous video that combat radius is determined in this case by internal fuel. The Razorback Thunderbolt has the same combat radius with a single 220-gallon tank as it does with dual 150s. I suppose that begs the question of, well, then what good is the dual 150 setup? Well, they don't increase the combat radius, and when dropped, they have the disadvantage of leaving the plane with twin wing racks, which hurts performance a little bit. Plus, you need two of them, but they do have some advantages, and one of those is standardization. They're the same tanks as used on a number of other aircraft, including the P-38, another Fifth Air Force airplane. Plus, they attach to a wing rack that can carry other things. The early P-47 belly rack was really only ever used to carry drop tanks. Having the ability to use that rack for air-to-ground weapons and not just a drop tank was of value. Third, the plane could go faster to the limit of its combat radius because the extra fuel allowed for the use of higher power settings on the way there. One thing that's always amazed me is how little drag drop tanks really add to the Thunderbolt. Let me clarify that. They add a lot of induced drag, but that's from the weight. It's the weight of the fuel doing that. The weight of the drop tank itself is minimal. Thus, that extra induced drag would be added if the fuel was in drop tanks or if it was internal. In fact, it would be more if it was internal because it's very likely those would be self-sealing internal tanks, which are heavy. The extra drag the drop tank brings to the party is primarily parasite drag, which is shockingly low. As an example, if run at max continuous power at 20,000 feet, a P-47 Razorback does 330 miles per hour true airspeed. If we add on dual 150-gallon tanks, it only drops to 320. It's about the same with any of the drop tanks for this airplane. Thus, they don't add as much parasite drag as a lot of people seem to think. As you go lower, the speed difference increases a bit, lower in altitude that is. For example, it's a 15 mile per hour difference down at 5,000 feet. Also, at lower speeds, induced drag becomes a bigger factor, and thus the speed difference will increase more. Thus, the later drop tanks have advantages, but not an advantage in maximum combat radius on a Razorback Thunderbolt over the earlier drop tank mounting system with the Brisbane tank. Now, one famous Thunderbolt mission was on December 26, 1943, or, because of the international dateline, some sources have it as the 27th. That's a constant issue when researching Pacific Theater stuff, the different dates because of the dateline. Anyway, as usual, there isn't a lot of information on this mission, but it appears from General Kenny's book that the Thunderbolts made a real mess of the Japanese aircraft trying to attack U.S. forces over New Britain. This was the 341st Fighter Group, which at the time was based at Finschhafen. The location described by General Kenny is about 230 miles from that base. As the war progressed, the U.S. moved westward on New Guinea, and in March of 1944, most of the 348th Group moved to Sidor, which was the most forward 348th base on New Guinea at the time. Gusop was 15 miles closer to, let's say, where the action was, and the 35th Fighter Group was based there. From these locations, P-47 started flying escort missions to Hollandia. That's 435 miles from Gusop, 450 miles from Sidor, which is farther than the distance from Halesworth to Schweinfurt. Although this is in March of 1944, it's very important to understand that this is with Razorback Thunderbolts, which have only 305 gallons of internal fuel, proving that escorting to Schweinfurt was not a problem for this airplane. Also, while I couldn't find mention of which drop tanks were used on this particular mission, every picture I can find of a P-47 in theater at this time is a version without wing racks. And when drop tanks are seen, they're the Brisbane tanks. As an example, even Neil Kirby's plane, the commander of the 348th Fighter Group, the plane he flew on his last mission, the plane he was killed in during the same month, was a P-47D4, thus no wing racks. I also want to mention that, I've said this before, but there just isn't a lot of detail available for some of these Pacific missions as compared with European missions. A lot of times we don't have details like takeoff times, landing times, numbers of aircraft involved. Sometimes those things are difficult or impossible to find. Now at this point, we have clearly shown various types of missions in the 300 to 450 mile range. But just how far were the longest missions with Razorback Thunderbolts? Or from a Japanese point of view, just how far back do we have to move our planes to be safe from these things? As U.S. forces continued to push westward, Thunderbolts were based at Nomfor, which was a little island. From there, they started employing new long-range techniques taught by Charles Lindbergh, which I'll explain soon. From this island base, they were hitting the Japanese, who at this point had moved their air power back to Keio, over 500 miles away. The Japanese were clearly trying to move their aircraft out of range of U.S. fighters, but to no avail. The Razorback Thunderbolts could now not only fly a mission over 500 miles from base, they could do it while carrying a 500-pound bomb. I don't have any pictures of these missions, but the Thunderbolts were likely D-15s and 16s, possibly D-23s, but definitely not bubbletops. They probably carried dual 150-gallon drop tanks with the 500-pound bomb on the belly rack. So that's another advantage of the big wing tanks over the Brisbane tank. It allowed for a lot of range and with a big bomb, something the earlier Thunderbolts without wing racks couldn't do. In any case, at least 2 missions were flown to Keio in early September of 44, one on the 6th, one on the 8th. Thunderbolts flew this mission a few more times in mid to late September, but we get into the date range which could have been flown with bubble tops. It's a range in which I can't be sure. These early September missions to Keio have to be the ultimate examples of P-47 Thunderbolt Razorback range. Over 500 miles with a 500-pound bomb. Attack the target, back to base. I don't know of any other World War II single-engine fighter that flew a mission that far with that type of bomb load. Now we're going to skip forward to October of 1944. The Fifth Air Force was now using bubbletop Thunderbolts. As with most aircraft during the war, the Thunderbolt was constantly being improved. In very early February of 44, the new D-25 models started rolling off the assembly line, but it took some time to get them into action. They started showing up in the European theater in May of 44 and sometime much later in the Pacific. The D-25s and later are often called bubbletops, of course because of the bubble canopy. They featured a number of upgrades, obviously the bubble canopy, but also an increase to 2,600 horsepower. There were also increases in fluid capacities. The water injection tank was enlarged, so was the oil tank, and the internal fuel capacity was increased from 305 to 370 gallons. The big increase in fuel resulted in an increase in combat radius. It was not quite as much of a radius increase as you might think. The new bubble tops are about 500 pounds heavier than the older models, plus 20 minutes of combat would now use 90 gallons versus 76 gallons of fuel for the older model, largely because the new model had so much more power. Plus, you had to factor in a little bit more fuel for reserve. Still, the new model had a combat radius of about 650 miles. This slide from the Hap-Arnold briefing shows 700 miles. It's a bit optimistic. This chart from Dean's book shows 600 miles, although it states right on the chart that it doesn't include the distance gained during the climb to altitude, and as we know, that's every bit of 140 miles. Bubbletop Thunderbolts in the 5th Air Force were pretty rare. I can't find a record of the 348th Fighter Group ever using them. The 35th Fighter Group had them, but as far as I can tell, only the D-28 models. Keep in mind, Republic came out with a new Thunderbolt during the war roughly every 6 weeks. I don't have the exact date the 35th Fighter Group got their new bubble tops, but the earliest reference I have for them is in late September of 44, and that's when the 35th Fighter Group arrived with P-47 D-28s at the U.S. base on Morotai Island. As you can see, the U.S. push to the west was relentless. This map is from a study from Maxwell Air Force Base on the U.S. air raids against Japanese oil production at Balikpapan, which is here. Google Earth puts the straight line distance from Morotai to Balikpapan at about 825 miles. Yet P-47 D-28s flew in support of bombing raids against Balikpapan on 3 separate occasions from Morotai. The first was a fighter sweep, and the other 2 were escort missions for B-24s. How are they doing this when it appears to be beyond the plane's combat radius? Not just beyond, but way beyond even the more optimistic 700-mile radius for this airplane. It would require another 250 miles, more than that, of extra distance there and back. Well, there were a number of factors. First of all, they took a lot of drop tank fuel. In at least one case, they ran a 300-gallon wing tank on one side and a 165 on the other. The D-28 can carry a very wide range of drop tank combinations. That enabled the plane to reach Balikpapan with its full 370 gallons of internal fuel. It could burn the drop tank fuel all the way there, and the vapor return had plenty of time to refill the main tank and put back in whatever amount was used during ground operations, takeoff, and initial climb. Hey, in this sort of mission, every gallon counts, so fuel management was important. Also, U.S. pilots in the Pacific had been using new range extension methods. This could be a whole video, but the short version is that by running the engine at very low RPM, combined with unusually high manifold pressure for such low RPM, they could extend the range of the airplane. This was combined with the use of manual leaning of the fuel-air ratio. The Thunderbolt, as well as the P-38 Lightning, could go much farther on a given amount of fuel using these techniques. This ran so strongly against the conventional wisdom of the time that they sent Charles Lindbergh out into the Pacific Theater to sell the pilots on these concepts, which worked. Lindbergh was never qualified on the P-47 Thunderbolt, but he did teach these techniques to Thunderbolt pilots. This not only made it possible for Bubbletop D models to reach Balikpapan, but to fight there for 25 minutes and return to their base at Morotai. The Allies had been attacking Balikpapan on and off for some time. B-24 Liberators struck the target at night in August of 1943. They took off in bad weather from Darwin, Australia, and flew unescorted under the cover of darkness. Only 9 of the 11 B-24s found the target in the dark. It's hard to gauge the success of this raid as U.S. and Japanese reports differ significantly. In April of 1944, the Royal Australian Air Force successfully mined Balikpapan Bay using PBY Catalinas. One of these mines sunk the Japanese destroyer, Amagiri, shown here. This is the very destroyer that rammed and sunk the PT-109. It's sort of amazing how often the PBY Catalina shows up in these stories. I didn't plan that in this video, it just happened. I do have an entire video on the PBY if you're interested. Regardless of the level of damage caused by these early Balikpapan raids, they gave the Allies information on the target, its defenses, and helped in the planning for the daylight raids to come. I'm going to gloss over all of the political maneuverings going on in the U.S. military over the Balikpapan raids. The short version is that there was some very real disagreement over how and where the Japanese oil industry should be attacked. Is it best to attack the weakest link in the supply chain? Well, yeah, of course, but where is that? Oil fields, oil refineries, oil tankers, oil storage, and then how are you going to attack it? General Kenny was still in command of the Fifth Air Force, and as new information came in, he changed his mind a number of times, but ultimately concluded that Balikpapan was the source of 70% of Japan's oil supply and thus was the best place to hit the Japanese oil industry. Post-war analysis showed that he was wrong. But with the fog of war, with the information available at the time, hitting Balikpapan was thought of as the best plan. Kenny wanted B-29s for the job, but he was unable to get those planes, so he came up with a plan working with what he had. That's sort of a general Kenny theme. What he had were B-24s, P-38Js and Ls, and P-47 D-28s, and his plan was to hit Balikpapan in the daylight. I should point out that not only did he not get B-29s, he didn't have P-51s either, and by this point the super long-range P-47 Novembers were rolling off the assembly line, but were not yet in theater. Now I want to stress that this isn't a video about bombers, or the Balikpapan raid specifically. I'm focusing on the Thunderbolts in this episode. Just know that unescorted B-24 daylight raids were flown against Balikpapan in September of 1944 and very early October. The planes had modifications and special operating techniques, the B-24s that is, to get from their bases, which were even farther away than Morotai. It was thought that sending unescorted B-24s to Balikpapan would be okay because Japanese air opposition seemed to be broken by this point in the war, at least from General Kenny's point of view. He had already crushed the Japanese Air Force on New Guinea, after all. What General Kenny didn't know, and what he couldn't have known, is that part of the reason Japanese air opposition seemed so weak was specifically because they had moved their best assets into positions to protect their oil supplies. Thus, the unescorted B-24s took a real battering, resulting in unacceptable losses from the Japanese fighters, which were using not only their machine guns and cannons, but an air-to-air bomb as well. They would drop this thing into the middle of the formation. It would go off and sometimes work. As a result of the Japanese fighters and other factors, these unescorted raids failed to put a significant number of bombs on target. The first mission that did put a lot of bombs on target at Balikpapan was a daylight mission on October 10, 1944. On that day, Thunderbolts flew a fighter sweep over the target to tie up Japanese air opposition. It's interesting to note that the pilots for the P-38s and P-47s on this mission were supplied with tablets of benzodrine sulfate, which were used as stimulants during the war. Later, this was a, let's say, recreational drug, then a prescription drug, and my understanding is that now it's not in use anymore at all, and with some good reason. The idea, though, was that after 9 hours of flying, the pilots would take these tablets before landing. The reality was that they took them about a half an hour before combat. The pilots were also issued, and I'm not making this up, morphine to minimize cramping during the 9.5-hour trip. I can't imagine what the chief pilot at my airline would say if I told him I wanted to use morphine to get me through these long trips. Anyway, on the October 10th mission, 2 P-47s were lost, one on takeoff and one in combat. I don't have reliable kill numbers, but I do know that the U.S. fighters claimed 57 Japanese aircraft shot down on that mission. I have not found a breakdown of those kills between Thunderbolts and Lightnings. It's a certainty, of course, that the actual number of kills were much lower. I'm going to guess probably 10 to 20. Just 4 days later, on October 14th, another escorted raid was flown. This is the raid that really finished off Balikpapan. The bombers did excellent work this time. One Thunderbolt was lost in combat, this exact airplane. The pilot's radio failed on the way to the target, and nobody saw him go down, so it's not clear what happened. But it's known that he shot down a Ki-43 Oscar before disappearing, never to be seen again. 3 other Thunderbolts were lost on this mission. 2 were wrecked on landing. It's hard to be at your best after 9.5 hours in the plane, especially when you took benzodrine sulfite 5 hours earlier and then some morphine. Plus, most World War II fighters were just not that easy to fly, and certainly not the Thunderbolt. The 4th was lost somewhere en route to the target, I'm guessing due to mechanical failure. That pilot was picked up by a PBY, once again making it into our story. As I stated, that mission on the 14th really knocked out Balikpapan, but another mission was flown on the 18th. However, the target was covered by clouds, Japanese defenses were already smashed, thus not much happened. It's noteworthy for us because it's the 3rd time P-47Ds flew a mission involving a round trip of about 1,700 miles with combat over the target. On all 3 of these missions, no Thunderbolts ran out of fuel. So it's ridiculous to argue that these planes could not have escorted to Berlin, which was a round trip of only about 1,000 miles with much easier navigation. Actually, escorting to Berlin should be another video. I'm not saying the P-47 didn't do it. I'm saying there are a lot of people who incorrectly believe that they could not do it. In addition to those 3 Balikpapan raids, P-47s also escorted to Sanga from Morotai, also about 800 miles each way. If you want more information on these planes or the Balikpapan raids, please consider joining my Patreon. The sources I used for this video can be found there, and it really helps me out. And of course, please like and subscribe. Now, it wasn't too long after the Sanga raids that P-47 Novembers started showing up. These had an easy 1,000-mile escort radius, and the capability to increase that radius as far as 1,500 miles via some very specific loadout and flight profiles. Not even the P-51 Mustang could match these numbers. North American did try with the P-51H, an incredible airplane in its own right. North American wanted to use a 100-gallon fuselage tank, but couldn't make it work. The P-51H actually ended up carrying slightly less fuel than the earlier D models. Thus, the Thunderbolt November has the longest escort range of all the World War II fighters. However, the earlier D models had more range than most people think. The Fifth Air Force, with their locally designed Brisbane tank, was routinely escorting bombers on 300 to 350-mile missions in 1943. That's far enough to have escorted to most of the targets the 8th Air Force hit in Germany in that year. But 350 miles wasn't even the limit. The Razorback could escort to 450 miles, and that's a very solid and conservative number. There can't really be any debate about that, not only because it's an official USAAF number from several sources, but also because Razorback Thunderbolts actually flew escort missions that far to Hollandia. There are also examples of this in the European theater in early 1944, after the bomber mafia had their come-to-Jesus moment and started prioritizing drop tanks. Again, this is with a Razorback, probably carrying twin 108s, giving it a fuel quantity quite similar to a plane with the Brisbane tank. Let's not forget that Razorback Thunderbolts flew 500-mile missions each way and carried a bomb to target. Then we have the bubbletop. A 650-mile escort radius was no problem for this plane, and an 800-plus mile combat radius was demonstrated on 4 actual missions. I don't think General Kenny gets enough credit. He started with relatively little and was up against the Japanese Army Air Force at its peak. He led the development of a decent drop tank and got it into service quickly. This allowed him to take advantage of the Thunderbolt's capabilities. Under Kenny, the U.S. Fifth Air Force constantly pushed westward, never losing ground. They never had to curtail missions into enemy territory due to unacceptable losses, as the U.S. Army Air Force did over Europe after the Second Schweinfurt raid. In fact, I don't think the 5th under General Kenny ever lost a battle. The 5th Air Force did lose 32 airplanes in one day, a bad day. That was on Black Sunday, April 16, 1944. But that wasn't due to enemy action. It wasn't due to poor tactics. It was due to the weather. Only one Thunderbolt was lost on that day, and it was parked, and an A-20 ran into it. The 5th Air Force, led by General Kenny, ultimately smashed the Japanese Army Air Force, which never recovered from its defeats over New Guinea. In fact, General Curtis LeMay said, "Air superiority over Tokyo was won over New Guinea." It's an impressive story. General Kenny, the 5th Air Force, the Thunderbolts, all of it. I'm not coming close to doing it justice here, but hopefully I've given you some insight into the contribution of General Kenny and of the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter groups in the Southwest Pacific, and some insight into how important it was to have a proper drop tank. Also, a tip of the hat to the Australians for making the Brisbane drop tank, without which the 5th Air Force Thunderbolts would have been virtually useless. Thanks to everyone for watching. I look forward to reading your comments below, and I really do read them. Goodbye, and have a great day.